All right, so we're going to touch upon evolution today, particularly looking at what Darwin contribution were with regards to how we understand evolution now. So mainly we're going to be focusing on Darwin and his contribution to evolution, and then we'll look a little bit at natural selection. So let's start off by looking at what we knew before and after Darwin. So before Darwin, there were still evolutionary biologists that were trying to theorize how do certain characteristics get brought about in different organisms, right? And so Jean-Baptiste Lamarck had this theory that is the use or disuse of certain structure that brought about this inherited change. And so he believed that if you use a certain structure a lot, that your offspring would inherit those changes in those structure, emphasizing the need for the certain structure. On the same note, if you do not use a certain structure, that over time, that disuse of the structure will result in your offspring no longer having that structure. So let's look at an example with regards to these giraffes, at how he thought that giraffes would acquire the long neck. So he theorized that originally the ancestor has short neck, and the short neck led to them not being able to survive because they weren't able to reach for the different plant matters, right? Which is what they need to consume in order to survive. So over time, if they just kept stretching their neck, the stretching would get acquired, and they would inherit this progressively longer neck to their children, which is close to what we believe today with regards to evolution. And we'll talk a little bit more as this lecture persists about how we adapted that belief to actually understand evolution now. But let's take a step back and think about what disuse of structure. So what if you had someone that had an accident, and in this accident it resulted in them losing their sight? So now they no longer have a need to use their sight. Their eyes aren't really functional anymore. Would their children then inherit that blindness? Your answer is probably no, right? That's not the case. Like, just because I become blind doesn't mean that my kids will be blind. So this kind of doesn't support this whole idea of inheritance of acquired characteristic. We also see that certain phenotypic change that occurs during our lifetime, such as the blindness, doesn't always result in this being a genetic change that we actually observe in our offspring, right? So again, we don't pass on the gene for blindness to our children just because we acquire the phenotype. Remember that phenotype has to do with what we observe, like what we can visually see. So while we have genes that encode for sight, the blindness from the accident causes us to lose that sight. But it doesn't change our genetics. So we don't pass those genetic change to the offspring. Darwin's idea were really close to Lamarck with the idea that we acquire certain characteristics, except what he found is that species often are suited to certain environment through no will of their own. And so we'll explain this when we actually go a little bit more into natural selection. Okay, so let's kind of look at some of the things that Darwin kind of had to accept. So when Darwin did his trip on the Beagle to visit other lands, he was not only studying different species, but he was also studying like geology and the fossil. And through the study of geology and fossil, what he concluded is that the Earth is really old. So why do we care that the Earth is old? Well, that means that there has been a long period of time for these different adaptations to occur. So over time, we can observe what is known as descent with modification, that is evolution. And so over time, different species will change, and because the Earth is so old, there has been a long period of time in which species can adapt and change with their environment. So this brings about the study of biogeography. What is biogeography? Well, this is a study of distribution of life form on Earth. And so here we're looking at two examples where we have on our left hand Patagonian, and on our right hand side we have this European rabbit. So this organism over here, the Patagonian, lives in South America, while this rabbit over here lives in England. And just visually, we can see that these two organisms look pretty similar, right? And so the question was, okay, well, do they look really similar because they've been adapted to environments that are pretty similar? So while one is in South America and the other one's in England, the environmental niche might be really similar. And so that's how these unrelated organisms might have evolved to have similar traits and or behavior, because they have to solve similar problems, right? So for them to be able to adapt and live in these environments, they have to somehow forage food, they have to somehow get away from certain predators, and so they end up evolving to have very similar structures and body shape and abilities so that they can adapt to their environment. And so we can see these being the case with other organisms as well, where you have these animals that live in very different regions, but yet over time, because even though they're in different regions, the environment are very similar, they have similar adaptation. This is also known as convergent evolution. And so can you think of another example of this? Okay, so what about, for example, Arctic versus Antarctic fish? So two different regions, right? The Arctic versus the Antarctic. But both these fishes evolved to have these proteins called glycoproteins. Why? Because they both have to kind of deal with these very cold temperatures. And so they have to be able to adapt to be able to deal with these temperatures. And so they develop these antifreeze properties. Another example would be bats and birds and their formation of wings. So due to them living in similar environments and having to have similar behavior with regards to their survival, how they forage food, where they reside in the evenings and stuff like that, these two organisms that are in the same phylum, they're both chordata, but very different class of animals, right? So you have mammal versus aves, are able to both evolve to have these structures that we observe as wings, right? Both bats and birds have wings. So you can see how they evolve to have these different structures because of the requirements that you need in order to survive, even though they're very different organisms. So when Darwin went to Galapagos, this was these little birds, these finches, are an example of observation he made that supported the idea of biogeography and his idea of evolution, right? What was observed was you have all of these little finches over here, right? All these little birds that have very different physical characteristics. And it was believed that these finches originally came from the mainland. So the Galapagos Islands are these islands that are off the coast of South America. And so it was believed that these finches could have descent from the mainland finches, but because they are separated and they live elsewhere, that over time, perhaps they evolve to adapt to their environment. And because their adaptation evolved extensively, and also because they are not able to converge and be able to colonize each other, this idea of speciation, which is came about. And this is the idea that different and new species are able to occur because these isolated populations evolve independently from other organisms. So in this case, there are these finches that live in these different islands because they're so far apart from each other that they can no longer colonize with one another, and because they are evolving independently in their own ecological niche, that they become new species. And so these finches are an example of that speciation, right? So their evolution is independent, and it is dependent kind of on their environment. So you have, for example, these ground-dwelling finch, that beak size is going to be dependent on the seeds they eat. So here is an example of one type versus these other types of finches that are tree-dwelling, so they live up in a tree, and so their beak size is going to vary because they're going to need longer beaks that they can actually go and find different prey, because that's what they consume. So because of these two different niches that evolve based on what they consume, whether it be insects that they are able to consume or whether it be seeds, that over time their beaks will adapt and evolve to very different shapes because of the environment that they're in. So let's look at one more example of this. And so here you have these tortoises that Darwin also observed. And so over here we have all these different islands, right? Galapagos Islands, and you have all these different tortoises. And if you look across, we can tell that they're all tortoises, right? We recognize their structures and kind of like physically we can identify as tortoises, but we also notice that they're all a little different. They all have certain characteristics that are different. And so we consider each one of these tortoises to be its own species. And these species evolve because they're isolated in on different islands. And so compared to the mainland population, they have independently adapted to each one of their environment. And so it's this adaptation that makes it so that these tortoises are more suited to their environment, right? So an example of an adaptation that we can observe with these tortoises is their neck size. So if you look over here, if we look at this guy, for example, this guy has a pretty long neck. Well, on the island he resides here, one of the reasons why this species might have adapted over time to have longer necks is because they're found in environments that tend to be drier, where food is not scarce, right? There's not as much rainfall. And so they have these longer necks in order to be able to search for food. So this is an adaptation of these tortoises versus this other species of tortoise down this island has a much shorter neck, and it's found in these environments that there's more of an abundance of food, right? Food is not as scarce as it is on these islands where their necks are longer. And so because of this abundance in food, these tortoises didn't have to adapt to have longer neck. So over time, this species has a much shorter neck because of their environment compared to this species up here. And then you have some that are mid, right? And so we can kind of infer that on these islands, maybe you have a good amount of food. It's not as scarce as here, it's easier to find, but maybe it's not as abundant as it is on this island over here. And so these are examples again of speciation, adaptation, and biogeography. So let's now move on to our next section, which is natural selection. I'll see you in the next slide.